So, today I want to talk about the Department of the Interior and its role in the genocide of Native American peoples. This is generally a topic that's very much underrepresented in histories of the United States. And it's worth mentioning in particular now because the Biden administration has done something absolutely unprecedented by appointing a Native American person, namely Congresswoman Deb Haaland, as the Secretary of the Interior. Historically speaking, the Department of the Interior has been responsible for enacting policies of the United States government towards Native peoples because Indian reservations are controlled by the federal government because they exist as federal land. So, the Department of the Interior and its subsection, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, has been largely responsible for enacting any of the policies that have caused harm and have been genocidal towards indigenous cultures. And so I want to cover this today by examining a few of these policies, the Dawes Act and the Indian boarding schools that existed, and by talking about how they shaped the history of Native peoples. And then I want to talk about the Trump administration's Department of the Interior and how it reacted and responded to Native peoples versus this major shift in policy that the Biden administration has put out there to just show some of the story, narrative, and history and why this move is so important to the history of this country. With that said, let's jump into the Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act can be generally broken down as having the following provisions. So the head of a family of indigenous peoples would receive 160 acres of land, and the allotment would be held by the U.S. government for 25 years. Native Americans who were eligible had 4 years to select a piece of land, and that would be made for them. If they didn't, it would be selected by the Secretary of the Interior. So that's what the official policy was. But what the underlying reasons for this policy of the Dawes Act were to break up the tribes as a social unit. Historically speaking, at the very least most, if not all, of the indigenous groups in the United States have had some sort of tribal or collectivist understanding of their cultural identity. They had a tribal social unit. And the goal of the U.S. at this time was to break those up, to encourage individual initiatives and further the progress of Native farmers to start producing crops for the rest of the country. They wanted to reduce the cost of the administration towards Native peoples, and they wanted to secure certain parts of the Native American land to be settled on and sold to white people for profit, specifically companies and corporations that could use that land for certain purposes. Examining it further, the Dawes Act was officially called the General Allotment Act of 1887, and it was named for Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who was the lead proponent of the act. Basically, the position was that they could take any land that was applied to the reservation for whatever purpose, and they could distribute it as they saw fit. So one of the things that went into the Allotment Act, is that, quote, Indian allottees were declared incompetent to handle their land affairs, and the United States would retain legal title to the land as trustee for the allottee. Indian allottees only had beneficial and usufruct title. In other words, as long as the allotment was held in the trust by the federal government, the Indian landholder could use the land but not sell it or lease it without the federal government's approval. So this was actually sold as a way to preserve the Native American culture and identity. In reality, that's not really how that panned out. The idea was that if the indigenous people could not sell their land, I mean, never mind being called incompetent being a large insult, but if they could not sell their land, it would keep the tribe together and keep the reservation intact. However, in practice, what the government did is take the most productive bits of land and start to say that it was surplus to Indian needs and would sell it off to white business interests. And so the US government essentially used the Allotment Act to steal from people. And even though they wanted them to farm, they actually never provided any sort of equipment for that. So oftentimes the land went unused, and they used that as a position to justify stealing further bits of land because, they were incompetent at using that land. Then in 1906, the Burke Act was passed, which allowed the Secretary of the Interior to decide if a person, an Indigenous person, was competent to manage land. If the person was deemed competent, the Secretary could decide at any point to take the land out of trust, make it taxable, and the Secretary of the Interior was authorized to do this without any knowledge of the person. Meaning that you could have an Indigenous person who would have their land sold for tax foreclosure or auction because the land was issued to them outside of the trust, but they were never informed that they had to pay taxes on the land. So another form of being able to steal from Native Americans. And this is the kind of behavior that you'd often see in these cases, and up to 27 million acres of Indigenous land was stolen as a result of these particular acts. This is the legacy of the Secretary of the Interior when it comes to that particular aspect of land in the US. That's also not factoring in the extensive history of land theft and thus cultural theft that has occurred in the United States. The history goes back to the Washington administration, the Jefferson administration, and the Jackson administration. It has been a part of US culture and identity to destroy and take Native American lands, and specifically to break up tribal groupings and individualize people to westernize them, to make them like the white people, and to civilize them. These are actual terms that are used in describing Native peoples and what the end goal is. And nothing exemplifies this more than the American Indian boarding schools that the federal government mandated. So the federal government mandated that children of Indigenous peoples would go to boarding schools to learn to be white. One quote that you had from Richard Pratt, who was an Army officer who founded some of these first schools, his philosophy was that a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. There is no greater descriptor of cultural genocide than that. To remove one's heritage and identity in exchange for another through a forced imposition onto children is nothing short of genocide. And the reason that this is a factor is that a lot of the children were forced to go to the schools if the people were to be recognized as having any sort of political power or citizenship in the United States. And there's a story of a 6-year-old, Bill Wright was his white name, who remembers matrons bathing him in kerosene and shaving his head in order to, I guess, remove the Native American from him. This is disgusting. These are the policies that the Secretary of the Interior has historically let happen. Students at federal boarding schools were forbidden to express their culture, everything from wearing long hair to speaking even a single Indian word. Wright said he lost not only his language, but also his American Indian name. And there's a story here where he goes up to his grandmother and says, "My name is Billy." And she has to tell him his name's not Billy, it's Taram. And maybe I'm mispronouncing that, but even that is an act of, power to keep one's name and identity in a culture when it's being removed from you. And the problem is that Billy, as his white name had become, could not understand his grandmother. You know, there's also the understanding that they were targeting Native peoples who were just recently hostile. There was a conscious effort to recruit the children of the leaders and to exploit them in a way to literally hold the children hostage. Because while the children were at the federal boarding schools and the parents had no idea where the children were, you could take these kids and use them as pawns to maneuver more land, to leverage against people. This was a tactic used by the federal government and the Department of the Interior to leverage federal lands from people so they could sell it to businesses, so they could sell it for profit to businesses. The idea really is that if you don't know where your kid is, you could keep these communities pacified and leverage power against them. That is despicable. And there's more and more and more of these stories of these boarding schools and the atrocities they've caused and how they tried to remove culture and identity. And so this ends up leading into pretty much the administration of FDR, where the Indian New Deal happens. And for the first time in history, while it may not have been perfect, there was at least some ability for Indigenous peoples to have a reprieve from the assimilation policies of the Department of the Interior. It's probably the only period in U.S. history where that has been true outside of maybe some select areas of modern history, like really modern history. But even still, there's tactics happening to this day that are absolutely atrocious. And we'll cover those very, very shortly. But after Truman took office, it's described as the end of the Indian New Deal and the beginning of Indian termination, the era of Indian termination, where, once again, the policy was to assimilate Indians, to integrate them into the wider national discourse, and to basically remove trust relationships, relocate people to urban centers, and destroy tribal lands and ancestral lands, and remove sovereignty from tribes in a desire to whiteify them and to bring them into white culture. There's actually a quote that I believe the Secretary of the Interior had said in the 1970s about the Native Americans and socialism. And I am just going to see if I can very quickly pull that up. Here it is. You had James Watt, the Secretary of the Interior in 1983, said, if you want an example of the failures of socialism, don't go to Russia, come to America and go to the Indian reservations. This policy did not disappear just, in modern times. This is a continuous practice. And if you want to see it greatest, look at the Obama administration with the Dakota Pipeline. And Obama was one of the better presidents because at least he took time to devote some energy to naming certain cultural and historic landmarks of Indigenous peoples as federally protected lands. But of course, the Trump administration reversed some of that. But one of the things that just drives me up a wall, this particular fact just took me out of it emotionally. So just be prepared for what you're about to hear. During the Trump administration, while attempting to build the border wall, Native American burial sites were blown up by construction crews with the blessing of the Department of the Interior. And this also adds to the fact that environmental groups warned that the damage being done to the underground aquifers could damage wildlife, and that's another factor. But you literally had construction crews blowing up burial sites of Indigenous lands to build a wall to separate, Mexico from the United States, when historically speaking, some of the groups that are at that border would travel through both countries. You are literally creating a barrier between indigenous groups and how they used to interact. You have to remember that historically speaking, the border between the US and Mexico was much, much further north. As a matter of fact, the original US-Mexico border was all the way up into parts of Colorado and all the way through California. I'm pulling that up right now. This is what we would have defined as Mexican territory, and parts of Texas as well, before it had declared its independence. And the whole history between the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You end up with this situation where both the Spanish in this territory and the US cultures end up setting boundaries that end up erasing the existence of indigenous lands and how they were understood, and how certain peoples would travel across what we define as borders today with no issue. So creating this border wall actually has a great effect, not only on these burial grounds that are being destroyed, but on the ancestral ways of a lot of people who would travel to and from the areas on either side of the border. So the Trump administration also has been using the coronavirus as a tool to distract Native peoples by allowing companies to frack on lands while they're trying to deal with the coronavirus, including the areas near Chaco Canyon, which is very much understood as an ancestral place of great value to several groups of people. And again, this is also coming with the fact that the Trump administration has actually denied a lot of the stimulus checks to Native peoples and made sure they conveniently didn't show up. This is still a legacy that's happening today. Furthermore, the Trump administration withdrew the, the tribal designation. The reservation designation from the Mashpee Wampanoag, who are recognized, typically speaking, as the people who the Pilgrims had their first meal with in 1621. And generally speaking, we think of them in that context and then ignore the fact that they exist, when in reality, they are still valid and alive today. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, again, under the Department of the Interior, removed that reservation designation, and thus that land was removed from federal trust and stolen. This is as recent as this year. So to see a president taking the time to care enough for indigenous peoples to place a Native American person in a position of power over the affairs of Native American peoples is huge. And to quote a historian in this particular case, the New York Times quoted this particular person: "The Department of the Interior was the driving force of modern-day genocide against the Native American peoples," said Elizabeth Cronk Warner, dean and professor of law at the University of Utah and a citizen of the Chippewa Indians. "We would be moving from the shadows of perpetuated genocide to a chair at the table, from being classified as a group of people that the federal government was trying to destroy, to having a president say, 'I see you and value you, to the point that I will raise you to the highest level of decision-making in this country.'" For those who want to make the argument that Trump and Biden are the same, this is my evidence to you that they are not, even with the affairs of people of color. Does the U.S. still have a ton of issues? Is Biden going to fix anything? No, but he's certainly better than the fascist that is Trump. And certainly has, at the very least, put out a gesture that has made a huge difference in a cultural understanding of Native peoples in this country. Never before have they had that seat at the table. There is a person who is against fracking in charge of the Secretary of the Interior, who has spoken out and fought against companies who have caused large-scale problems for indigenous lands, who have damaged water supplies, who have desecrated sacred lands, who have blown up burial grounds, who have caused acts of genocide against Native peoples. There is now a Native American who is actively fighting for Native peoples in that position of power. This is a person who spoke out against the Dakota Pipeline. This is the person that Biden chose over all the corporate-backed people that he could have possibly put in there to lead this country, to lead Indigenous peoples, and to represent the federal government as the Secretary of the Interior. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.